So tonight I want to share with you a way of looking at the body that doesn't involve individual organs, that doesn't involve a liver and a stomach and a brain as separate parts, but that involves a kind of energy flow, a kind of interaction between all these systems. What Buckminster Fuller would say, a view of the body not as nouns but as verbs. It's a wonderful way he had of viewing the world. He said, think of going through a few weeks in your life and not using nouns and only using verbs, and what that would do to your sense of how to navigate through the world. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is really the interaction between these two figures. What this is what we'll call a biofield therapist, not physically touching the body of a client, but using their hands several inches above the body to affect clinical healing. And down here is, as we'll get much more familiar with in the course of the evening, is a view of connective tissue that exists between the inner layer of the skin and all of the glands and viscera and tissues and vessels in the body as a continuous web. It's one of the most underrated and underprivileged systems in the body that's only finally coming into its own. And how we get from here to here is what we call through a biofield. What does that mean? The first time I came into contact with the concept of biofields was an article by Dr. Beverly Rubik in 2002, and she described biofields as a collage, as a mix of self-regulated fields, all generated by the body, and at that time she viewed these as largely electromagnetic, and that these fields could be clinically diagnostic and modulated by healers to affect health. So what do we mean by clinically diagnostic, these electromagnetic fields? Well, we're all familiar with certainly the ECG from the heart, from the brain, the electroencephalogram, and these are the two strongest fields. But Chinese medicine tells us that every tissue in the body has a field around it, and people think that we're just getting more and more sensitive instruments to detect these fields, and someday we're going to be able to detect fields from all of the tissues in the body. The other part of Dr. Rubik's definition is that these fields can be modulated by healers to affect health. So there are a family of biofield therapies of external Qigong, healing touch, therapeutic touch, Reiki, which are used in many hospitals. Jorei is a cousin of these that comes from Japan. And all of these therapies are taught and clinically used by a combination of physical touch, hands-on, and non-physical touch, hands-off. And what I'm most interested in is we have several explanations for how you can get stress reduction, how you can relieve pain, how you can increase well-being with physical touch through massage. We have some concept of physiology through sensory nerve endings, release of hormones. We have no idea within the biomedical model at this point of how you can get healing without physical touch. That basically was the challenge that I gave to myself in terms of my Scholars project. So to do any kind of research in an area that's called alternative medicine, one is faced with the problem of these being called alternative medicine or complementary medicine. And I remembered when I started out to look at these biofield therapies, a quote that I came across, a statement very early on in the days of alternative medicine, when there was just an Office of Alternative Medicine at the NIH. And the whole point of this, as you can read, is that we have to stop labeling things as mainstream or conventional or alternative. We just need to ask the question of, do they work? This was a quote from someone you may know, from Dr. Brian Berman, and I always remember this as a guideline that we have to stop labeling. We have to simply do the research like we test any type of intervention and ask the question, do they work? So, that said, welcome to the world of biofield research, where you are encouraged to think both inside and outside the biomedical model. Biofield therapies. So this is a definition that comes from the Therapeutic Touch International Association. The Reiki Association have similar definitions, but they recognize a family of intentionally directed interventions that involve an energy exchange with the practitioner using both, as I said, hands-on and hands-off techniques to facilitate healing. So what do we mean here by energy? This is the big question. What do we mean by energy exchange? Any kind of energy we know, like metabolic energy or kinetic energy, has very different properties than the kind of energy that apparently exists between a healer and healee, between the therapist and the client. So we have to really decide, as we look at the research, what we mean by energy. And as I said before, what I want to focus on is off-the-body healing. So I set myself 4 questions when I started my Scholars project. The first, as I've said before, is non-physical touch biofield therapy effective? This means I've set myself the task of reviewing all the scientific literature to see what the evidence had to say. The second question had to do with, during the healing process, the question really is, can we measure, can we detect any changes that happen in the healer? Is there such a thing as the healing state? Perhaps a healing state of consciousness that's different from an ordinary state of consciousness. So that was our second task, was to review all the studies that have been done so far to see what we could find on measuring anything in healers during healing. And the last 2 questions, what we used to say $64,000 question, $64,000 isn't going to get you very much research these days, but that sort of dates myself. So what's happening between the healer and the healee? What's going on between the hands or between just the physical presence of the healer? Those of you who are physicians, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. There's a sense that happens during the therapeutic encounter between you and the patient that's palpable. What is going on? Is it the same kind of thing that's going on between a biofield therapist and a client? And finally, a really interesting question that perhaps after dinner and another glass of wine or 2, we can really talk about is, what are the implications of biofields for integrative health? So here's a study, and this is the only study with animals that I'll talk about, but it's so clear for evidence for non-physical touch. This is a study on Reiki and simply using animals in an animal room that are fairly stressed at baseline. But what they did was they took one group of animals that just were in the animal room and a second group of animals that were subjected to double the noise in terms of the level of decibels for 15 minutes every morning. Okay. A third group got Reiki treatment for 15 minutes before the noise every morning for 3 weeks. And the last group got something which we call sham Reiki. Now, you may want to know what that is. You can't really do a sham massage. Nobody's figured out how to do that. But if you're not physically touching the body, you can actually do sham Reiki on humans, and you can certainly do it on animals by asking someone who's had no experience with Reiki, no experience with any kind of energy work, and you say to them, watch the Reiki master and do with your hands whatever you see that master doing? That's the best we can do in terms of a control, which we need to do in research. So the end point is with stress, we know there's always, in humans as well as animals, some microvascular damage. So the animals are injected with a protein that fluoresces so you can detect vascular damage. So with noise, the vessels begin to leak to a very marked extent, and the size of the leaks is also greatly increased with the stress of just noise. The Reiki treatment before the noise greatly reduces the effect of the stress by both our measures, and the sham Reiki to a slight extent also reduces it. But we get a major effect of Reiki in animals where the Reiki is being given 1 foot away from the animals. What about humans? This involved our literature search. We identified 75 clinical trials of one or another form of biofield therapy. And since nobody tells you in the abstract or in the title what kind of therapy they used, whether it's hands-on or hands-off, we had to carefully read each paper. And of those papers, we identified 21 that actually stated that they used only non-physical touch and compared it to either sham therapy or what they call mimic therapy or to another active treatment. And we don't automatically take all the trials. We apply a set of criteria. We're only going to look at the trials that were well designed and well reported. So we dropped 4 that didn't meet our reporting standards. Of the remaining 17, 12 found the biofield therapy to significantly improve at least one of the primary outcomes that they had set up, 70% of the trials. So we think there is a there. Our second question was involving physiological changes. Have anything been detected in biofield therapists during healing? This was a study that I did, review that I did with my colleague, Dr. Ann Baldwin at the University of Arizona. We were very disappointed, I'll tell you right now, in what we found. There were no robust changes that have been yet measured. The changes in EEG were both inconsistent and very similar to the changes that people saw in meditators, or even changes that people saw with increased attention, the kinds of changes in EEG. Heart rate variability, many of you may know, is an increasingly fascinating diagnostic. It measures really the extent to which we can cope with change. And the greater our variability in the heart rate, the healthier we are as a measure. But no changes were measured in the Reiki therapist or the therapeutic touch practitioner during treatments. Some small changes were measured in 2 other types of biofield therapy, reconnective healing and Bruyere healing, to suggest an aroused state, but again, inconsistent and not very robust changes. Here's the big question then. This is our third question. What's going on between the therapist and the client, between the healer and the healee during a treatment? A lot of excitement is generated, and you'll see in almost any review of energy medicine, this study from Japan quoted, where of 37 external Qigong practitioners who were tested, 3 showed very large magnetic fields. For those of you into it, it's 2 to 3 milligauss from the palms of these practitioners. Now, everybody wanted to be able to detect something from the palms. The only problem is the size of the magnetic fields are about 1,000 times stronger than the electromagnetic field from the heart. So people really questioned the unlikeliness, but we don't know. This is an area where we are just slowly beginning to navigate. So Dr. Baldwin, who I mentioned before, my colleague, decided to try to reproduce this phenomenon using state-of-the-art magnetoencephalography using a device called a squid. It's sort of the cousin to the functional MRI, except it's measuring magnetic fields. So they went down to Scripps Institute in La Jolla. They tried all kinds of tests with Reiki masters, and they were unable to detect. They got all kinds of weak magnetic signals detected, but they found no major signals from the palms or from the head of any of the Reiki practitioners. So the two aspects that Dr. Baldwin talked about, they were studying Reiki practitioners. The earlier study was using Qigong practitioners. But more interesting, when you go in to have any kind of medical imaging done, it's done in what we call a shielded room, so that you don't get any electromagnetic fields that could interfere with your signals. Whereas these early studies were not done in shielded rooms, and they were done with basically magnetometers, gradiometers that were made in somebody's garage, basically. Not that they didn't work, but that they were used not in the kind of controlled conditions that you would hope for. So, not to despair, 2 months before I was to give this talk, a paper appeared citing new evidence that appears to be non-electromagnetic to detect human biofields using a very simple device with a complicated name, a torsion pendulum. So I sent the paper to Brian and Sue because you get a random scientific paper, it can come from results done anywhere in the world. And I looked at the paper, and wouldn't you know that the two authors of this paper were right here in Baltimore. So we got very excited. Brian and Sue invited them here, and they're with us tonight. Okay, Dr. Hansen and Dr. Lieberman. And I will very briefly not do total justice to their setup, but I'll show you just briefly what they did. Okay, what this device is very similar to the kind of wire mesh hemisphere that you would put over your fruit bowl to keep the flies away. A very simple wire mesh device. And the key, it's not only suspended from the ceiling, but the key here is a small stretch of fishing line, basically, of monofilament line, so to absolutely minimize the friction. And on this wire mesh is a white dot, so the video camera records the position of the dot in 3 dimensions, and the camera goes to a USB port to a computer, and it plots the oscillations and the direction of the oscillations. If you had no subject present and you put a little puff of air, then it behaves just like a pendulum would expect. You get a nice perturbation, and then it gets damped out and essentially stops. If you bring an ordinary person, not a biofield therapist, just a person to sit under this, you get a remarkable series of movements of the hemisphere with a set of varying frequencies, oscillations that vary in the direction. And moreover, when the person then gets up and leaves, these odd, unusual frequencies persist for anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes. Now, 2 of the controls they did are really important. You could say it's a wire mesh screen, so maybe there's static electricity. So they grounded both the screen and the patient. Still got the same results. And finally, to make sure it wasn't any sort of electrostatic charge buildup, they had a very similar dimension hemisphere built out of cocoa fiber, so organic, so no metal. Okay? Patient comes, not the patient, the subject comes and sits underneath it, the same kind of perturbations. So, moreover, the kind of force that you would need to set up these kind of movements is much stronger than any sort of magnetic force that's been measured off the body. So right now, this is where it stands. Other people, it turns out in the past, have done similar kinds of studies. We know of at least one group on the West Coast that's right now, as we sit, trying to reproduce these studies. And the last thing I'll say about it that Dr. Hansen says is that every person that they try, they get the same results. So we don't know the nature of the force. They've done a few studies looking at when a person gets needled with acupuncture. Do we see any changes? There's we discussed a number of other controls they could do, but it's a very exciting finding, and I thank them for publishing the paper right before my talk so I could include it. So as a recap, biofield detection, commonly used as a diagnostic approach, moderate evidence from clinical trials for effectiveness of non-touch biofield therapies, some physiological changes detected in the therapist during healing, but no compelling evidence, and preliminary evidence of this human biofield non-electromagnetic field detected with this pendulum. Big question now for me as a physiologist. I think the way we're going to get biofield therapy to be accepted is same thing that homeopathy faced. It doesn't matter how many clinical trials we do, we need to have a physiological basis for it. So what can we say about what we know about the body? Is there any system within the body that may be detecting biofields as a means of physiological self-regulation? Again, this is what the Chinese have been telling us for thousands of years. What you want to be able to do is detect changes before they become signs and symptoms. Is there a system in the body that's trying to detect these? So a little perspective is, before 1960, there was a neurology department, an endocrinology department, an immunology department. They were, as several people have said already, in separate silos. Then what happened was, in the mid-1960s, we got neuroendocrinology, and in the early 1970s, we got a field called psychoneuroimmunology because people were recognizing that these systems were talking to each other, that each of the systems were using the same molecules to communicate, each of the systems had the same receptors, and we no longer could get away with looking or studying or researching these systems as separate entities, but we had to look at the body as a whole system. I want to suggest, first decade of the 21st century, there may be a fourth main system in the body. What we know, as I said, this connective tissue at the start appears as a lattice. It's a three-dimensional lattice between the skin and all of the guts and glands, and here is the vessels, so it wraps around. It's a body-wide network, so it goes from your toes up to your head. We've always known and thought it provided structural support, and what it's made up of is predominantly collagen fibers. What are collagen fibers? Anyone been to the sculpture garden? Where's George? In South San Francisco? This is a sculpture of collagen. Collagen is, you've all heard of the double helix. Collagen is a triple helix. You know, if you want a really strong rope, you make a triple helix. That's what collagen is. These three different colors, you can see how they're wrapping around each other. But there's some evidence, which is very exciting, that the outer shell of this triple helix binds water in such a way that hydrogen ions, protons, zip along those outer shell at a rate that's faster than nerve conduction. In fact, they've coined this term, which I'll get to a bit later, called proticity. Instead of electrons moving, protons are moving, so they use the term proticity. The most dramatic advance in this understanding of connective tissue comes from a French hand surgeon in Marseille who was doing these heroic operations of restitching on a finger or a hand from industrial accidents. And they were finding that the healing wasn't behaving like the textbook said it should. So he got together, this hand surgeon, with an engineer, and they developed a video endoscope. This is a one-minute video, and they call it in French, promenade sous la peau, in English, strolling under the skin. So it has, this is now on YouTube, so this is a 1-minute clip from the video. And as I said, it's the first time that we can actually see what the connective tissue, what the fascia looks like.
With rings that reinforce the solidity like an articulated bamboo stem. Transparent sails, dewdrops. Travel along these pearly structures and you notice the same fractal arrangement everywhere. Large fibrils endlessly punctuated by other smaller ones. The tissue continuum is total, the marriage homogeneous, and the arrangement completely fractal. A world of fibrillar chaos. The human body would seem to be one and the same tissue that has differentiated over time, but whose basic organization is stereotyped. Yet this organizational framework supporting life must have its inherent rules of behavior. How are these structures organized? How do they resorb and move, and what?
So, what do we now think about the connective tissue? We think that evolution would not have created such a whole body system without it also being a system to carry information, to receive information, to integrate information. How can this information flow along the connective tissue matrix? Remember I was talking about proticity? Proticity is this movement of protons along the long axis of the collagen fibers. So imagine this is zipping along. What is it doing? There comes a point in research and in science where you have to say, here's where the data stops and here's where the speculation begins. And as long as you're really clear that this is speculation, which I'm going to share with you now, we're okay. I don't want anybody thinking this is coming from the data. Okay? I'm envisioning, do we know how in the immune system there's one particular class of cells called the natural killer cells. And what they're doing 24/7 is surveillance. They're constantly looking for any invading microorganisms. They're constantly looking for the formation of microtumors. Then they signal other cells to get rid of them. So 24/7 they're doing surveillance. I'm going to suggest that the collagen meshwork using proticity 24/7 is constantly, by a kind of sonar, an echolocation, is looking for, and again, I'm going to use a very unscientific term here, it's looking for microstucknesses. And these microstucknesses may be at a physical level, or at an energetic level, or, as I hope we'll begin to see, there's really no difference between saying a physical level or an energetic level. It's measuring the same thing. Okay? So it's constantly bouncing off all the tissues in our body, and it's checking to see where there are imbalances in the field, and that's giving the system information about where there are preclinical problems. And at that level, then the body can mobilize all sorts of forces to massage, if you like, to counterbalance the microstuckness. So, in summary, if this is our connective tissue, it's somehow, perhaps through this system of proticity-based sensing, is detecting internal biofields. At the same time, it's detecting biofields from the earth, from practitioners, from devices, and it's integrating this information and sending the body signals as to how to balance the problems and receiving the problems. So that's the model I want to leave us with, to thinking about how all this is happening as we sit here. There's this three-dimensional network in us that's moving and changing and sensing, and we're not just sitting here. So we all grew up in high school learning the term homeostatic. Well, we have to really rethink now and call it homeodynamic, that's what the body is doing. It's in constant motion and constant process. So this is a few ideas that I said I hope will continue later this evening. First is to expand our view of the body, as I said, from homeostatic to homeodynamic. I think that if we learn how to detect these biofields, it may be a very important way of screening for, quote, preclinical health, a measure of prevention. We all talked briefly about how heart rate variability is now a very important measure of health. This can be done non-invasively. You just measure heart rate, and then there's a computer system that will turn into the heart rate variability. So maybe we're going to have BFV, of biofield variability, and that's going to be a measure also of health. And if we can get a measure to monitor the activity of the connective tissue matrix, if that's the system in the body that's detecting these microstucknesses, these imbalances, that's going to be really important, again, as a measure of what we'll call preclinical health. And finally, I believe it's really critical to understand the need to stop thinking of ourselves as separate people in the world, as separate organisms. We have to increase our sense of interconnectedness once we get a sense that we're within each other's biofield. When we meet each other, good things can only happen. So put your hand, one hand on your arm, and just say after me that I don't end here. Okay, that's really the message I want to leave with you tonight. Think of what that means. So I'll leave you with this recreated cartoon from the New Yorker, where these two dolphins are jumping out of the water, and one says to the other, "There, down there, that's what I've been trying to tell you about. We're living within the biofield. We're unconscious of it. We have to make ourselves aware of what it is." So finally, I want to give great thanks to the whole TIH community, both the staff and to my fellow scholars, especially for support, encouragement, and stimulation. And finally, I have a colleague who said, you know, we've been through hi-fi, we've been through Wi-Fi, and now it's the biofields. So may the bi-fi be with you. Thank you.